Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. And if you enjoy the show, then don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app, and please leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you. The films of Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger are among the jewels in the crown of British cinema. After falling from favour at the end of their careers, the duo, known as the Archers, have seen their reputation revived recently thanks to restorations of classics like A Matter of Life and Death and The Red Shoes. Powell and Pressburger brought a unique brand of imagination and fantasy to British screens in the 40s and 50s. But one half of this British institution, Emeric Pressburger, was a Hungarian Jewish refugee. And his background is rarely commented on when people discuss the Archers' great achievements. Pressburger's life took in so much, the glory years of the German studio system, anti-Nazi wartime propaganda films, and ultimately some of the most spectacular Technicolor fantasies ever put on screen. He brought Central European sensibilities to the British public. But how do we locate the Hungarian element in the films of the Archers? To figure out the Pressburger puzzle, I had the pleasure of welcoming back Ian Christie to the pod. Ian knew Pressburger at the end of his life, and along with the likes of Martin Scorsese, has helped to kickstart the Powell and Pressburger revival way back in the late 1970s. So he was perfectly placed to discuss the life and times of this fascinating figure. And make sure to check out the links in the show description to explore Klassiki's own collection of Hungarian titles through the ages. Ian, welcome back to the Klassiki Podcast.
Nice to be here.
You're gracing us with your presence once again, but really I had no choice when it came to this subject matter. I've been wanting to talk about Emeric Pressburger on Klassiki for a long time. And since Martin Scorsese is not available, Ian Christie will step into the breach because you are someone who knew Emeric Pressburger well towards the end of his life and who has done so much work on the Powell-Pressburger partnership, but on Pressburger in particular. So it's great to be speaking about Emeric Pressburger with you. What I'm interested in, I guess, in talking about is the Hungarian in the British. You know, that Pressburger is one half of this iconic British filmmaking duo. Since their reputation has been kind of rehabilitated a number of times at this point. But I mean, recently there was a big retrospective again at the BFI. We had this Martin Scorsese presented documentary about Powell and Pressburger. They're back at the forefront of people's conception of British cinema. And there was this Hungarian Jewish stateless refugee at the heart of this partnership. And I find that really fascinating. So let's see if we can get into that relationship. Do you want to just briefly tell us a little bit about the character of the man that you knew to set the scene?
Well, Emeric was a very, I wouldn't say shy, but he was very quiet and very reserved. And he wasn't the kind of person that, you would bound up to and embrace. He seemed rather withdrawn. He had a slightly hermit-like quality, I suppose, when I first met him back in the 1970s. He'd very consciously left the film industry, and he wanted to be a writer. He'd written, 3 novels, in fact, or 4, even if you count the Red Shoes novel, which he did with Michael. And he saw himself very much as a writer. He was living in a wonderful cottage, which he called Shoemaker's Cottage. Get the reference? Red Shoes, in the heart of the countryside near Ipswich. And he would feed the birds every morning who came to the pond outside his cottage. And you had to work at getting him to open up, shall we say. And I think over the years that I knew him, he did open up to a degree and gave me some insight into really what had shaped him. And what had shaped him, of course, was, as you imply, as you say, being a refugee. He'd started life in Hungary, in what was then Hungary, but the borders of Hungary kept changing, of course, in the early years of the century. So he was in Miskolc, which is a town that's back in Hungary, but I think was in Romania at one time when they redid the boundaries.
Transylvanian town.
Exactly. I've been there, and I've taken part in a ceremony which they put on to really recognize the birthplace of Emeric, or Imre, as he is, of course, in Hungarian.
Of course, yes. His name was Imre, his Hungarian
His name was Imre, and Michael Powell always referred to him as Imre. Strangely, I never asked Michael why he did this, but that was how they spoke to each other. So he left Miskolc up and went to, I think, Stuttgart first of all, and he was in several German cities getting his education. Eventually, he wound up in Berlin, pretty much penniless. He was writing short stories, and there's this kind of great, moment, sort of epiphany. He's pretty much literally sleeping on park benches, he told me at one point. He writes a story, it's published, and that leads to him being taken on by the great German film company, UFA. UFA, the biggest film company in Europe at this time. Yeah. And so he's actually taken on there right at the beginning of the sound period in cinema, at the beginning of the 1930s, end of 29. And for that moment on, he's a man of cinema.
Yeah, you're right. So I think he was in his maybe early mid-20s when he arrives in Berlin, and as you say, he gets kind of swept up into the UFA system. I mean, we should probably just dwell for a second on that. UFA was, as you say, it was the largest studio in Europe. It's hugely kind of influential in film history because this was, the site of Lang and the German expressionists, many of whom would then obviously go on to Hollywood and take that influence over the Atlantic. But I mean, it was also this kind of center of gravity, really, for this kind of Central European film culture, right? I mean, because obviously Pressburger is a Hungarian, but lots of kind of Austrian, Hungarian, and obviously German, Czech, Bohemian artists all kind of concentrated in Berlin. What was the atmosphere, would you say, at UFA at the time, and how did that match or challenge, let's say, Emeric's personality, his literary personality?
Well, I think it was like becoming part of a gigantic going concern, as it were, as you say. And there are photographs, a few of him from that period. He very quickly took on the trappings of being, a successful film writer. He was assigned an office. He was, I think, driving a car. He was doing all the things that you did if you'd arrived in, the biggest film industry in Europe. At this point, at the time that he starts at UFA, the British film industry is absolutely in the doldrums. I mean, if he ever thought about Britain, which I'm sure he didn't a lot at that time, he would have seen an industry that was kind of in ruins. And it's perhaps worth saying that, Emeric, part of a generation which who all had to flee Germany, or almost all, but he was preceded by Alexander Korda, another Hungarian, and Korda had already taken off from Hungary and established himself as an international, transnational filmmaker. So the path that Emeric would follow, in a sense, had been staked out already by Alexander Korda. And that I think is quite significant. I mean, Emeric wouldn't have known this when he started working at UFA, obviously, but it was a path that had been trodden before him. Yeah. And I think it's also worth saying that, yes, it was very Austro-Hungarian, the atmosphere around UFA. And it was also the beginning of the sound period. So Emeric starts with talkies. And the first scripts for UFA is in fact the very first talkie in Germany, Abschied, farewell, the farewell. And it's really significant, I think, that he arrives in cinema just at the moment when movies begin to talk. But of course, they're talking German in Germany, so he's already fully competent in German. although he's working with German crew and partners. And that's the beginning of a sort of linguistic displacement, which will, of course, mark his whole life.
Yeah, Korda's a really important figure. We're definitely going to have to come back to him once Pressburger lands on British shores. Yeah, it's interesting you say he kind of starts and ends his life as a writer.
Exactly. Most films at this period, everywhere in the world, are taken from a literary property, a short story, or a play, or a novel, or something like that. So yes, Emeric was already in the right groove, if you like, to produce ideas for films, and he did rather intensively. I mean, he had 3 or so years at UFA, working on a lot of scripts and becoming a friend of really some quite influential people. Robert Siodmak, who would then go on to Hollywood
Oh,
and
right.
become a key figure in film noir. He directed Abschied, and they remained friends. And even, I mean, tantalizingly, there are so many tantalizing things in Emeric's career. One of the early films he worked on was the first film by Max Ophüls.
Really?
Ophüls was in theatre, wanted to get into film. Emeric works on a script. It's a lost film. Let me say that straight away. But it's a short film, a medium length film, and it's a comedy about kids who change places with their parents.
Yeah, I mean that European kind of Berlin-centric film culture in the 20s and 30s. There's so many names who kind of go on to become canonical elsewhere, mainly in Hollywood, and they're all kind of swimming in the same pond, as it were, at the time. So many tantalizing connections. I just wanted
And
to.
also they stay in touch. I mean, one other name to throw in is Billy Wilder.
Oh, of
Billy
course, yeah.
Wilder was a contemporary and I think mostly a friend. They certainly spent time together when Billy Wilder came to Britain.
I wanted to ask before we leave Germany with Emeric. I mean, obviously he has to leave in the mid-30s because of he was Jewish.
Well, in
And
33,
in
as soon as
30,
Hitler comes to power, he has to leave, yes.
yeah, he goes to Paris briefly, and then in 1935 he comes to Britain. I just wanted to ask, was his Jewish identity an important aspect of his life for him, of his creativity? Obviously, it was a factor in this displacement that he experienced, but was it an important part of his life as you knew him?
I would say not. I mean, we never talked about Jewishness per se, but of course, it emerged that one of Emeric's deepest, most traumatic memories or anxieties was the fact that he had not rescued his mother. When he had left Germany, I know that he felt very bad about the fact that he could perhaps have rescued his mother before she was taken, as the Nazi regime tightened its grip. And in a funny sort of way, I think Emeric did what a lot of Jewish refugees did. That his Jewishness became muted. He was never, as far as I know, an observant Jew during his time in Britain. At least I never saw any sign of that in later life. And I think in many ways he became quite close to the Christian church. There's a lot to be said about what was his relationship with Jewishness and with Christianity. But he wasn't going to talk about these things openly. A very private man.
So he leaves as the Nazis come to power. There's that great quote that I'm gonna mangle it, but something like, "I left the key in my apartment door so the stormtroopers wouldn't have to break it down." And then he goes to Paris briefly, and then he decides he'd be better off in Britain. And he arrives in Britain in 1935 with a stateless passport, a real kind of refugee in that sense. And he falls into this pre-existing kind of Hungarian emigre community around the orbit of this figure, Alexander Korda, who you already mentioned. So this is really interesting to me, that there was already this Hungarian community, Hungarian artistic community, cinematic community, and this figure of Korda who kind of changes the course of Pressburger's life. So how had this community come to be, and who was this figure of Korda?
Korda was a kind of magician. in many ways, and a rogue in many other ways too.
Like all the best producers.
Indeed, if you want an image of Korda, probably think about the red shoes, because Michael Powell always claimed that Lermontov, the rather sinister head of the ballet company, was modeled more on Korda than on anybody else.
That's not a compliment.
Well, it is and it isn't. High standards.
Wow, sure.
The joke was that you didn't have to be Hungarian to work with Korda, but it certainly helped. And yes, you're right. There was a circle of, emigres. Korda, of course, had not left because of Hitler. He was already in transit, a very mobile figure in the film industry of the late 1920s, and a very ambitious one. And he came to rest in Britain after stints in 3 or 4 national cinemas. He was actually he became a partner in United Artists as a result of his Hollywood period. So he had real clout in Hollywood, even before he came to Britain. But he did come to Britain. And the reason I think he came, apart from anything, well, 2 reasons, which are both relevant. One is there was a new Quota Act in Britain, which meant that there was a demand for British films. And I think Korda, who was a great businessman, saw the opportunity to create a quality cinema in Britain. But the other thing I think is that, and this is quite important, I think what I've come to realize is that Hungarians of that generation had a real deep feeling for England and for Englishness.
Where do you think that came from?
It's in their education.
I see.
Emeric knew, for instance, the work of G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was
a weird
everywhere.
thing to imagine, isn't it?
Yeah, he knew it backwards and forwards. And so Hungarians, in a sense, have a better take on Englishness than the English did. That's the way I would put it very simply. They really understood Englishness. And they were kind of super English. They would behave in a very English way. Korda calls his company London Films. His office is within spitting distance of Buckingham Palace.
Where else would you put it?
Where else would you put it? None of this Wardour Street nonsense. He's on Piccadilly. He's also, he becomes a close friend of Churchill. Churchill is broke during most of the 30s, no money, and Korda advances money to him for scripts and for ideas for films. So in a way, Churchill owes him. And it perhaps is no coincidence that Korda is the first English filmmaker to be knighted.
So yeah,
so there you have it. He becomes super English.
Yeah, this is so often the case, though, isn't it? That the most and I guess this is the subject of this whole conversation, that the most quintessentially kind of the figures who are most kind of quintessentially identified with these kind of national characteristics are somehow actually outsiders or aliens, and that the process of assimilation is the thing that creates the quote unquote authentic version of that culture. So yeah, one idea that I'm really interested in here is that with Hollywood, right, we know we can list the kind of canonical figures who come from Central and Eastern Europe and revivify and light up classic Hollywood cinema. Lang, Billy Wilder, you already mentioned, Ernst Lubitsch.
Lubitsch, first of all, Lubitsch is the man who really laid the foundation.
Michael Curtiz, another Hungarian, Mihaly Curtiz is his name. And, that's a kind of accepted part of Hollywood film history. But we don't talk in the same way about Britain. And I guess part of my contention here is that we should. Certainly with Hungarians, they seem to have, as you say, they had this affinity and they had the community, they had the numbers to get the job done. So through Korda, Pressburger meets Powell during the Second World War. This is a story that's been covered amply elsewhere. I love Michael Powell, but he's been given his flowers many times already, and we're here to talk about Pressburger. Let's just establish for people, Powell and Pressburger, they meet and they very quickly realize they have this creative and personal bond, this affinity for one another, and then by the end of the war, they are kind of set up as this successful partnership known as the Archers, Powell and Pressburger, working in this kind of very interesting, innovative, collaborative, the Powell and Pressburger film, written, edited, and produced, directed, and produced. What's the credit? Written, directed, and produced by Powell and Pressburger.
Directed by Powell and Pressburger. It was an unusual. It remains a unique credit. There's no other partnership that has adopted that joint signature, and it caused a lot of problems. I think it was proposed by Michael, but the partnership was actually created by somebody who's never normally talked about, and that's Chris Mann. Christopher Mann was their agent, and I think it was Chris Mann who steered them into this very interesting power position under the umbrella of Arthur Rank. Arthur Rank became their, although it was, this is the hard thing to remember, it was Korda who brought them together. They were both under contract with Korda in 1939. They'd never met. Korda had a project for Powell, and he brought Emeric into the room, as it were, to rewrite the script. And Michael realized that this was somebody who had a very powerful sense of story, of narrative, and a very unusual sense of narrative, because the way Michael described it, and again, this is worth emphasizing, he turned the whole story inside out. He took a rather conventional thriller, and Emeric rewrote it so that it was much more intriguing than it would have been. And Michael had suffered from poor scripts right through his apprenticeship during the 1930s. And he knew, I think, at some level, he knew that scripting and narrative was not his strength, but it was Emeric's.
Mm.
Yes, you're right. Of course, they realized they had interlocking skills, because for Emeric, for a writer, it was really important to find a director who wasn't going to muck about with his script. For a director, it was important to have somebody who would produce interesting, provocative, challenging structures. And that's the point at which they met.
That film was the Spy in Black. That's in 1939.
Yeah.
And like you say, they meet under the auspices of Korda, and then their great successes come when they're working for the producer Arthur Rank, and they kind of have this production company, The Archers. They start to bring together this company of returning characters, in both in front and behind of the camera, including some other emigre refugee figures like Anton Walbrook, the great actor who plays Lermontov in The Red Shoes and many other roles. His name was Adolf Walbrook. He was a gay Austrian refugee. Changed his name to Anton.
Who, by the way, Emeric would have probably seen at Ufa, because Anton Walbrook was already a minor star at Ufa, appearing in musicals and things like that. But he would have seen Walbrook, as he then was, in the distance, as it were, as a performer, probably. I like to think that they would have probably reminisced about the old days at Ufa when they were working on the great Archers films.
The standard line is that Emeric would come up with the story idea. With Powell together, they would kind of work out the script. And then kind of on the floor, as it were, Powell was directing in the kind of sense that we understand it, but that Emeric was always there and kind of offering his insight and making sure that the story kind of hung together, as it were. And then after they'd wrapped the shoot, Powell disappears up to the Scottish Highlands on a restorative walking holiday, and then Emeric kind of steps in a kind of what we'd now probably call a kind of producer role. He works very closely on the music. He was a great music lover and a great musician himself. And then the way I understand it, Emeric also kind of handled publicity and the glad handing that comes when a film is released. Is that roughly?
I think
right?
That's roughly right. It ebbed and flowed a bit. Certainly, Emeric never interfered with Michael on the floor. Michael wouldn't have tolerated that, and Emeric had no wish to, I think, be on the floor. But there are pictures of him sitting, as it were, away from the cameras with members of the cast, and he was certainly very active at the editing stage. And it was editing in those days was not the way people think of editing today, with the director sort of hovering over the editor and being closely involved in it. Michael shot films in such a way that he felt it was perfectly straightforward how they should be edited, and he didn't need to go into the editing room. But there were
Classic
decisions.
director.
Yeah, there were, like John Ford, same kind of generation almost.
Well,
Emeric
Ford
was,
shot his films in sequence such that he kind of edited in camera to prevent the studio from being able to take that control away from him. If the Archers had this famous control over their own material, probably Powell didn't even occur to him that someone would mess with his vision.
no, that's absolutely true. They had no difficulties in that direction as long as they were under the umbrella of rank. What then happens, and maybe we should flash forward to what happens when they reach the climax of their partnership with, A Matter of Life and Death, which is the first Royal Command presentation with King George VI, and the Queen and princesses attending it, a grand premiere in the Odeon Leicester Square. Kind of things start to get difficult after that, because Britain is in deep recession after the war. Britain is bankrupt, broke. They get as far as the Red Shoes, and then it all falls apart because Rank's manager, John Davis, doesn't like the Red Shoes. The film has gone over budget, over everything, and it marks the end of their relationship with Rank. And indeed, British cinema in 1948 is in a terrible state. And they go back to Korda, which probably seemed logical at the time, but what they perhaps didn't realize was that Korda was just as broke as everybody else was. And although he does fund one fantastic production, Small Back Room, basically he loans them out to Hollywood producers who are on the lookout for films they can make in Britain. And he loans them out successively to Selznick and Goldwyn, two of the most notorious Hollywood independents of the period. And that's the first time that they have this humiliating experience of seeing their work bent, twisted, re-edited. And they don't like it. They really don't like it. It's a very tricky period for them, because they've not had this kind of interference. And it's against the general background when everybody in British cinema is suffering at the end of the 1940s. It's a terrible time to be a filmmaker in Britain.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there, because the Archers have this reputation for this great freedom and for this great imagination that they're allowed to that they're able to pursue in their films together. But it's also often commented that absent the war and the kind of motivation that it provided to allowing them to make this kind of great statement of these humanist values, films like Canterbury Tale and A Matter of Life and Death, and then absent a very licentious producer like Arthur Rank, it very quickly kind of fell apart for them. It wasn't really a sustainable model. It was kind of operating at too higher pitch. And then we don't need to kind of get into per se the way that the partnership gradually dissolves, but
I think that there's something to say about that, though. But let me just mention one thing, that one of the reasons why Michael and Emeric increasingly pulled apart was that, in a sense, Emeric had a number of relatively conventional subjects as scripts ready to go, at least from Michael Powell's point of view. For Powell, after The Red Shoes and after Tales of Hoffmann, a great film they made in 1951, he wanted to keep on experimenting with the image, music, and increasingly almost non-narrative subjects. And Emeric didn't really want that way at all, which is a little strange, perhaps, because Emeric had a much greater feeling for music, I think, than Michael had. But he still saw filmmaking in, at least from Michael's perspective, relatively conventional terms. And although they ended their career making a great war film, The Battle of the River Plate, Michael didn't want to go on making films like that, whereas Emeric did have more subjects like that he would have pursued. But yeah, they were moving in different directions.
So let's go back to this central question that's been puzzling me. When we talk about these Central Eastern European emigres to Hollywood and what they brought to Hollywood, I think people have a general sense that they brought both the kind of the heritage of that kind of German system, that expressionistic way of filmmaking, and they also brought what you could kind of offhandedly call a kind of like European sophistication. Someone like Ernst Lubitsch or Billy Wilder or even Michael Curtiz, they bring this kind of wit and wit in the screenwriting or wit in the kind of production design and a certain elegance to Hollywood. And we understand that there's a kind of contrast between America and Europe there in a kind of cliched sense. So I know that Powell said that what he saw in Pressburger wasn't something Hungarian, but just a kind of a genius and a fellow artist he could relate to. So I'll put it to you instead, Ian. What is the Hungarian in Powell and Pressburger? What is the Central European, the Hungarian, the Jewish, the refugee in Powell and Pressburger, just for you personally?
Oh, I think there's plenty of it. And, there's no better example than what I think is their greatest film together, A Matter of Life and Death. Because A Matter of Life and Death is based on, in large part, a Hungarian original book. It's a memoir by the great writer Frigyes Karinthy, and it's called A Journey Around My Skull. And it's
a much better title.
Well, it's a story about Karinthy's experience of actually having a brain operation because of a tumor in his brain. And without that as the core, I think, of the film, the idea, the script, it wouldn't exist in the form that we know it. And it's also a perfect example of how they work together, because what Michael brought to it was a passion for medical correctness, detail. One of the things that makes the film so wonderful is Michael determined to recreate what a real brain operation was like in the film. But what Emeric brought to it was the extraordinarily imaginative idea of somebody who's, fighting for his life in heaven, as it were, in his imagination, and also on the operating table on Earth. It wouldn't have existed without the Karinthy original, I think. It's such a daring idea, but it took the two of them together to bring it off, if you like. So that is the simplest way of explaining. But I think, I've written several articles about Emeric as a screenwriter, and I think he had a wonderful idea, a wonderful ability to think about the shape of a story. And I Know Where I'm Going, which is a film that they made very quickly because Technicolor wasn't available for A Matter of Life and Death, is actually based on a kind of dream idea coming from Emeric. It's a very simple idea, and it's elaborated in such a kind of poetic way in a series of shifts that move you through the story as the central character, Joan, goes on her journey to the Hebrides. And that very much comes from Emeric, I think. Michael gives it shape and atmosphere and a sense of place, but Emeric gives it a dream logic. And I think that is something that's coming from, if you like, his Hungarian sensibility, just to put it sort of simply. So again, it's a perfect fusion, but there's no question that what makes that film so different from the run of many English films of that period is, if you like, Emeric's coming at it from a Hungarian angle.
Yeah, it's that way of making the familiar British landscape or story strange. Something like Canterbury Tale is a great example of that as well, isn't it? That sense of somehow taking this very almost kind of prosaic countryside landscape and then revealing the strange currents underneath it. I think you probably need that slight outsider perspective to do so.
Well, Canterbury Tale is an even more interesting example because that film was considered a failure when they made it.
It was a commercial failure.
Well, people say that. I'm not so sure, but that was certainly how Michael remembered it. They were very down on it when we first showed it in its restored version in 1978. But crucially, what Michael said initially was, I did Emeric a disservice by not insisting on making it less strange. Not his words exactly, but that's what he meant. And yes, there is a kind of real expressionist core to it. The phantom glue man who's stalking the night around Canterbury, which is ludicrous in a British film of 1944. But in the Canterbury Tale, yes, you get a weird fusion of the English pastoral, which comes from Michael, it was made on his home territory, and the, if you like, the expressionistic weirdness that Emeric gives the film, which I guess we could trace back to his Ufa background.
Right, yeah. Walking the corridors with Lang and Murnau in
Absolutely.
Berlin.
Yep.
And there's also that sense, isn't there, that somehow, like you said, you were saying earlier that these Hungarians had this affinity for English culture. And there is, without resorting too much to cliche, there is a sense that the strange manners and eccentricities of English life and the kind of English class system had a kind of parallel in this eccentric metropolitan coffee house culture of Austro-Hungary and Central Europe, that there were basically these two cultures of very mannered eccentrics, and that somehow they came together in this partnership.
Absolutely. And a lot of Hungarians, I met a number of Hungarians of a suitable generation, they kind of seemed almost more English than the English. They took to the eccentricities of English society, especially upper crust society, with great ease. And I think a good sign of that is that a fellow Hungarian exile, George Mikes, who became a very big, popular writer in England with a whole series of books, starting with How to Be an Alien. It's the classic book about Englishness. It's got all the old jokes like, English buses come in threes, things like that. They're all there in the book, and it's written by a Hungarian who's observing England as he finds it. And interestingly, George Mikes, who was a good friend of Emeric Pressburger's, dedicated the last in that series of books, How to Be Decadent, to Emeric.
How to Be Decadent.
Dedication reads, to Emeric Pressburger, the only man I know who is not decadent, but there is still time. And it's a very sort of ironic Hungarian type joke, one Hungarian to another. They used to meet together, those emigre Hungarians. Arthur Koestler was another, of course.
Oh, yeah,
he's
of course.
Cancelled figure these days. But Koestler, Mikes, Emeric would meet together and talk Hungarian and eat and drink superbly well, as was their wont.
And I guess the final image I have of Pressburger is that his tombstone in the kind of Anglican churchyard in Suffolk, where he's buried, has the Star of David on it, which is just this beautiful encapsulation of that hybrid identity we've been talking about.
It is very much so, and also I think the kind of afterlife of his creative work. Just recently, a film that's based on one of his novels. The novel is Killing a Mouse on Sunday. The film is Behold a Pale Horse by Fred Zinnemann, based on Emeric's first novel, has been hailed as a forgotten masterpiece. So I think there's a lot to discover in Emeric's extraordinary imagination.
Well, I think we'd better leave it there. We could follow Pressburger down all number of rabbit holes, but Ian, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure to get into this question of Emeric Pressburger, Powell and Pressburger, and this wonderful Hungarian artist at the heart of British film. Ian Christie, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Sam. It's a great pleasure to talk about Emeric, or Imre.